Okay. I think we get going, hey? Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ko David Callanan, toku ingoa, no Australia, oku tipuna, ki te noho o ki te Tamaki Makano, he General Manager Corporate Trustee Services, Aware Public Trust. Tēnā tātou katoa. So welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon on cybersecurity. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Callanan, the General Manager for Public Trust's Corporate Trustee Services team. Cybersecurity is a bit of a hot topic for all of us right now. It has been for a little while. Cyber threats are becoming more sophisticated, more frequent. It's at the top of our agendas. Hopefully everyone will be taking something away from today's webinar, something that might be able to help you move forward with greater confidence, or at least with an idea of where you might need to make further progress. Now, to help us better understand the current and future trends around cyber threats and how we mitigate them, and why cybersecurity isn't something that just the techie should care about, I'd like to welcome and introduce our illustrious panel. So, even though it's an incredibly busy week for them as the hosts of Cyber Smart Week this week, we're lucky enough to have two of the CERT NZ team with us, Director Rob Pope and Jordan Heersping from their incident response team. Welcome, Jordan and Rob. Thanks for joining us. Just as a quick intro, so Rob's had a long career with the New Zealand Police and has also worked in the New Zealand Fire Service. He was appointed to the inaugural position of Director at CERT NZ in 2017. So for those of you who don't know, CERT is the government agency that works to support organisations and individuals who are affected by cybersecurity incidents. And Jordan has spent several years honing his skills defending networks from the many cybersecurity threats that technology causes. After moving into the incident response arena to help others protect their systems and respond to attacks against them, he's now leading the charge to raise the standard for cybersecurity across Aotearoa, New Zealand, as CERT NZ's Incident Response Manager. Thanks, Jordan, for joining us. And another person who's always busy is Lyall M, the Head of Information Security at NZX. So we're delighted to have Lyall join us to share more about the NZX's distributed denial of services attack back in 2020. Lyall was hired in the wake of that attack and came to the NZX with many years of experience working overseas in Europe and in the US in particular. He's fortunate enough to have been mentored by some of the top chief security officers in the financial services industry in the States in particular. So really looking forward to hearing your insights, Lyall. And we've also got our very own Jerry Coe, the head of assurance in the CTS team. He'll be providing some insight for us into the increased oversight from the regulators and what it means from our perspective as supervisors. So I've prepared a few questions to ask the panel that hopefully, as I said, will help us lift the lid on the latest trends in cybersecurity and what we all need to be doing to protect our organisations and to maintain the integrity of the financial services industry as a whole. So in terms of practicalities of process, you're welcome to pop any questions you might have in the chat. And we've got Jolene monitoring those and she'll make sure I become aware of any that might be relevant at the time. But we've also got some time at the end for Q&A, as I said. So we'll make sure that we cover any questions that come through either directly in the chat or we'll raise them in the conversation in the panel. And if there's anything that makes sense to follow up outside of the time that we've got set aside for the webinar today, then we'll make sure to follow up on those as well. So that's the plan. So with that all said, let's get started with the discussion. Look, from my end, just to kick things off, I think cybersecurity's been in the forefront of the regulators' agenda in recent years. You know, the FMA released a paper on cybersecurity and operational system resilience not that long ago, which noted an increasing trend of cyber attacks across all industries. But I think, you know, New Zealand's financial services industry is a pretty popular target. So in light of those increasing threats, the FMA identified shortcomings in the cyber resilience at some of the entities that they regulate. And in particular, I think a relative underinvestment in technology. And that focus is largely on prevention. But one of the things that I'm keen to talk about today is response, because I think that's probably been the poor cousin for too long. The FMA also outlined cyber resilience as an area of focus in their annual corporate plan. They did that last year. They've done that again this year. And therefore, that reiterates, I think, to FMCA regulated entities, when you're licensed by the FMA, you've got a standard condition from a compliance perspective that requires you at all times to have adequate and effective systems, policies, processes, and controls. So you need to maintain those to an effective level. So that's a timely reminder that this is it's a business issue. It's a compliance issue, but it is also a compliance issue, and that's what I'm keen for us to explore both of those because it is a true business and livelihood issue for us. So let's start the panel discussion with a broad view of what's emerging in the cybersecurity space, I think. So I'll be keen to hear from you, Rob. Let's think about that. So with the increasing prevalence of these cyber events across the world, and we've seen firsthand examples here in NZ, it really seems like it's no longer a case of if you'll be subject to a threat. It's a case of when. So is that consistent with the way that CERT NZ is thinking about cybersecurity, and what other emerging trends are you seeing in terms of cyber threats? You double clicked on your mute button there, Rob. Oh. No, it's not letting you in. Oh. We might need some help, Felix or Jolene. I want to hear from Rob. Charades.
Sorry, Rob, try now.
Have you got me now?
There we go.
Oh, thank goodness for that. So not a good start for a technology webinar. Look, thanks very much for that introduction, David. And I mean, that question you ask is quite a potpourri of different sorts of perspectives and angles that I think are interesting all of us these days. But just as a general start to this conversation, we're certainly seeing greater awareness and a more mature understanding of the severe impacts that cyber attacks can have on businesses and New Zealanders. And as you've rightly pointed out, response isn't necessarily that well understood or applied, which again reflects perhaps just the journey we've been on as a country over the last 3 odd decades. This conversation is reflected a bit in part, I think, by the shift from what's been a relatively permissive and voluntary buy-in approach to cybersecurity to, as you've referenced, this getting much greater oversight and legal accountability for poor systems management. That in turn has been driven by acknowledgement that no tech system is infallible. And as we are probably all well aware, it's got weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are exploitable in the wrong hands. That's the premise that CERT New Zealand's based its response and preventative services on, that going to not the if, but the when, and how can we best protect ourselves. And that in turn requires us to understand the environment we're actually operating and living in. One of CERT's core requirements is to develop a deeper understanding of New Zealand's cyber threat landscape. Until we've been established, we've never really had a coordinated and collated view of what's actually happening in New Zealand. But over the last 6 years, we're now starting to get a better sense about what is actually happening and what's actually going on in terms of our ability to mitigate or prevent some of these issues that are hitting us. So through a combination of reports we've received, managing incidents, and the global information sharing we engage in, we're getting a much better handle on that. So just some of the trends that we've observed is something which I don't think will be a surprise to anybody, but the majority of issues are either triggered by behavioural actions as opposed to pure technology defaults or weaknesses. So, and we, the people clicking on links, a whole range of different business compromises as a result of employee behaviour. one of the other things we've noticed is that these cyber baddies have operate highly structured mobile business enterprises that are difficult to detect and shut down, but they're very, very quick to pivot against any sort of perceived fallibility or weakness in different systems or people's behaviours. While there's a great focus put on nation-state actors, the majority of these issues are actually financially driven and referenced and underpinned by data. So these are the new speech marks, oil revenues in the technology age. And we've seen the quite significant number of incidents over the years in terms of data breaches. And we know those are used to leverage some very, very expensive and deep-reaching campaigns. So these forces of evil have technology to hand that is actually constantly probing our systems for chinks in our armour. And importantly, they can scale very quickly once they've actually identified their focus point. And we've seen that emerge over the years with the creation of campaigns leveraging off public or social interest type areas like the Christchurch earthquakes, mosque shooting, White Island. And we're just talking before we came on about the prevalence of the texting through the MOT type things, the warrant of fitness, the click and pick up the non-existent parcel from NZ Post and the like. So this is probably the area which is most predominant, which is this use of social engineering and the behavioural approaches to urgency, fright and flight, trying to force people to act before they've actually thought, and through that creating a consequence of different triggers that result in significant losses at either a business or an individual level. Coming through all of our reports, phishing is the dominant threat vector impacting businesses. So as much as we might think this highly sophisticated technology destruction, phishing is the most cost-effective and most beneficial threat vector that these baddies are using. And we see this materialising in business email compromises, e-invoicing and the like. And also the knock-on effects in terms of a whole range of identification issues, our data breaches, and that being used then to actually develop further campaigns. Another area that New Zealand's not unique in this particular environment, but the exploitation of legacy systems, and we've seen that with the WannaCry campaign a wee while ago that hit the UK NHS. We find that New Zealand was very lucky. Most of the public health system is still operating off legacy systems. So these vulnerabilities exist as a result of investment decisions or inability to understand investment. We're also seeing third-party exploitation, which is where for example, the Reserve Bank last year, this is all public knowledge, had a third-party provider, Excellion, in the States that through service level arrangements, which were not kept up to speed, actually resulted in quite a significant data breach where this vulnerability was exploited where in fact it shouldn't never have occurred in the first place. And then we're seeing this initially ransom attacks. They've now become hybrid ransom attacks where they combine with DDoS type attacks, then followed by a ransom, and not Petcha. And you may have heard of that 2-3 years ago in terms of the Maersk shipping line, which basically shut the whole organisation down. New Zealand wasn't immune from that. All the parent companies took their systems offline, and 5 or 6 big organisations in New Zealand were forced to go to paper transactioning, and I think that resulted in probably about $30 million of lost revenue over the 3 or 4 days that they were operating off paper systems. So that's just a very quick potpourri of just some of the trends, some of the thoughts that we've sort of identified or seen over the last few years.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. And it's actually a good segue for Lyall, because the DDoS example, the hybrid example that you provided, I think, is pretty similar to what the NZX experienced in 2020. So, Lyall, this might be a good opportunity for you to share the NZX firsthand experience about what happened back in 2020 and how it happened.
Good on, Koto, everyone. So I'll try and sort of keep this as minimally technical as possible. So for those of you that are unaware, a denial of service attack is where sort of a bad actor tries to make your system or systems unavailable for legitimate use. Generally speaking, and what NZX encountered was where they flooded the sort of internet surface of NZX with traffic, so that the servers and firewalls and whatnot were overwhelmed and couldn't respond to legitimate requests for traffic. That's a very non-technical description of what occurred. So NZX was quite lucky in as much in 2019 they began a big process of modernizing its sort of networks and internet service, and then come 2020, there was some threat intelligence rolling around. I'm sure CERT were part of that as well. That said there were a number of malicious actors starting to pay more attention to New Zealand as somewhere where they could make some money. So I think it was in about August 2020, some ransom threats were sent to NZX, which were basically along the lines of, if you don't pay us money, we're going to take your systems offline. Unfortunately, because it was sent via email, most of these went into spam mailboxes, or to mailboxes that weren't monitored. So the threats were missed. But again, this is part of background noise of the internet. These sort of things occur all the time. So even if they had been registered, they might not have been acted on. And then subsequently on 25th of August in 2020, sort of people trying to access NZX websites started to notice that there was a fair amount of deterioration in service. And then sort of ultimately the websites dropped offline. Now, sort of denial of service, by overwhelming systems in itself is a generally fairly blunt instrument. It's just using a club. You just send as much traffic as you possibly can find, and generally the way they do this is they install malware on sort of as many systems as they can around the internet, and then use those to send traffic. So your home PC could have a virus on it that then becomes part of this sort of it's called a botnet, but it's basically a network of compromised machines that are put together into one big sort of attack network that sends lots of traffic at a target organization. Now, what was different about the NZX attack in 2020 was the scale and the complexity of how they undertook this. So the amount of traffic that was sent at NZX was, sort of probably the best way of encapsulating it was the attackers were sending the equivalent of about 130 HD Netflix movies at NZX every second. So sort of that's the amount of data that was being sent at NZX. Now again, lucky that we'd upgraded all of our perimeter services, and what was in place was reasonable. However, it wasn't enough. So sort of it got overwhelmed. I think in total, NZX lost about 3 days of trading. And again, I think if you look at the media, you would think that it was months and months of disruption, but it was actually in total only 3 days. Sort of I think the knock-on effects were sort of having to buy newer and more robust technologies to protect our service. Sort of increased scrutiny from the regulators, from the media. the public, anytime there's a cyber attack in New Zealand, we're the poster child. So we always get a mention along with a couple of other organisations now. So we're not alone in the room. So again, sort of the regulatory response was fairly hefty. We did sort of clear our obligations to the FMA earlier this year, where they came back with a pretty hefty number of obligations that they required us to meet. But that hasn't gone away. So, just on my desk on Monday, landed a new request for information from the FMA just to make sure that we're still doing a good job. So, I think that's in a nutshell, a very short nutshell, I can assure you, compared to how much data and report writing is behind this attack. But yeah, that's the general gist of what occurred in 2020 for NZX.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thanks, Lyall. And I think it's a good point to bring Jordan in, because Jordan's obviously your role comes in at that point when the event occurs. And I think, as I said earlier, our approach to cybersecurity is changing. The posture is not just about prevention, it is about response. So what is the role of CERT in that regard? And do you have any specific examples where you've been involved recently that you could share with us?
Yeah, sure. So kia ora everybody, and I'll kick this one off with sort of what do me and my team do. And keeping in mind we are only a small part of CERT as a whole. But what we do primarily is we receive, analyse, triage, and advise on reports from cybersecurity reports from the public, from small to medium business, and large organisations as well. And this can be anything from, we've already mentioned a phishing attack, to, at the bad end, a ransomware attack. So there's a huge variation in the nature and seriousness of these incidents. We also coordinate incident response activity at a larger scale when there are bigger cybersecurity incidents, and this could be across organisations in the public sector or private sector, or a bit of both, depending on what's going on at the time. We have a few services that we share publicly to try and help improve the resilience across New Zealand, one of them being one where we share phishing indicators. And we send those around to other organisations to try and protect their networks as well, and make sure that all their users and stuff don't receive those nasty little emails that could lead to worse things. We also monitor a whole bunch of forums. We're involved in a whole bunch of networks, and have relationships with people and organisations where we are keeping an eye out for data leaks and vulnerabilities and that type of activity. So, for example, if we come across or get informed of a list of credit cards on the internet, we will take a look at those. We'll pass them off to the relevant banks and get the banks to contact their customers. Or if we get a list of credentials that have been breached by a bad actor who's been conducting a phishing campaign, we'll reach out to the owners of those networks or the users directly if they're a home user, and say, hey, look, we're from CERT, something's happened to you, your credentials have been stolen, you're probably going to want to go change your passwords, and here's some other security advice too. More towards the vulnerabilities type of things, we look out for new and scary things on the internet that could affect existing technology. I think it's probably the simplest way of putting it. And we try to get word out to organisations and the public in general if they need to know about what they can do to avoid being affected by vulnerabilities like this. So going from there onto incidents, look, we can't talk too specifically about incidents because that's would give away who's being affected and may cause some issues around privacy there. But Rob's mentioned already, we see lots of scams and phishing, text messages, emails. We've talked about social engineering triggers already and how the actors will use urgency and fear to try and get people to click those links and try and give them information. And once they get that information, they can either log in as someone, or they can impersonate them, or conduct identity theft and all sorts of things. If we want to look at a couple of incidents more broadly, we can look at things like Log4j was quite pertinent sort of around Christmas last year. And this affected a huge proportion of organizations across not just New Zealand, but the world as a whole. I mean, the vulnerability that that was behind this was very serious and embedded in a lot of technology products. Our team across CERT was quite involved in a lot of analysis on what was going on, a lot of the patches that were being released, and coordination between not just New Zealand, but a lot of coordination in Australia as well. So helping with international agencies to make sure that everybody had the information that they needed to protect them and their systems. I suppose also top of mind at the moment is Optus, and I know that's been in the news a bit recently. As far as data leaks go, I'm not going to comment on the nature of the attack, but just as an example, what CERT did here is we took what information had been made public, and we reached out to any New Zealand individuals who had been affected by that. Just send them a little email to say, hey, your details are out there in case you haven't received communications already. Here's what you need to do. Just be careful and that sort of thing. We've mentioned ransomware attacks already, but we have seen a few recently where data has been exfiltrated or stolen from systems, and it turns into almost a double ransom attack. So the first part of it is they ransomware your system, you can't do anything, or your computers are broken and they want money to restore that. If you have good controls and have proper backups and are able to restore, you'll sometimes find out that they've stolen a bunch of sensitive data as well, and then they'll go on to say, hey, look, we've got this data. If you don't want us to release it publicly or sell it to one of your competitors, maybe pay us some more money or we'll do it. So yeah, there's a huge variation in the kind of attacks and a huge variation in the people that are affected. And we do everything that we can to support organizations and individuals that are affected by these attacks.
It's fascinating that your role is more than just reactive. It sounds very proactive in search of looking for the threats and helping some New Zealanders address those threats and maybe even inform them of something that has specifically arisen for an individual. So yeah, not something I was aware of, Jordan. Something specifically though, from what you mentioned, you talked about the triage process. So in a practical sense, what's the best way for an organization to reach out to the CERT incident response team and I guess enter into that process?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is probably through our website. We've got a reporting form on there. It'll just ask for a few details around what kind of incident you're experiencing and how to contact you. And if you don't actually need help, just state that it's a FYI report. That's also useful for us because that builds that picture that Rob was talking about earlier about getting a better understanding of where New Zealand is with its cybersecurity, what we need to do to improve, etc. But yeah, that form is a really good entry point to get in contact with the team, get some initial advice on what's going on and how to recover. And if you need more help, we can work from there too.
Excellent. Okay, good. So cert.co.nz, I guess, is the starting point, and work from there. .gov. Sorry, I meant to say that. I knew that. So let's just pivot a little bit then, Jerry, and bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit about the regulator and the supervisor. So, what kind of questions would public trust or other supervisors be asking of our clients when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, as a start, Kia ora koutou. As a start, I would say that for any regulated entity such as MIS, supervisors regularly ask questions in relation to the entity's FMCA license obligations. And cyber resilience would form a key part of those obligations. So those questions would not only be asked on senior management to assess their preparation and awareness of cyber risk and resilience, but also from those in charge of governance. For example, the relevant risk and audit committees and even the board. Perhaps more specifically, these questions could include whether or not these entities are aware of the regulator's view of cyber resilience, in fact keeping up to date of what the regulators are saying, for example the FMA, and whether or not cyber resilience is part of, well, they need to be aware that cyber resilience is part of the FMCA licensee obligations. Questions could also be asked as to whether or not cyber risk is well understood by both senior management and the board, including wider implications to its business and operations, and in the case of FMCA regulated entities, implications on investors and external stakeholders. A great example in this, I guess, in this instance, is that if an MIS manager were to experience a cyber breach, they could very likely, or it could very likely result in more significant business and regulatory implications, such as loss of investor personal data, resulting in a privacy breach. As a result of that, there could be, both legal and significant legal and financial implications, as well as loss of reputation of that entity. A supervisor would also ask questions about what response and recovery plans there are in place of that entity, and whether or not they have been trialed or tested on a regular basis. So that's sort of more or less what a supervisor would be talking or asking questions about.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
So so from our experience with FMA, it all comes back to risk, right?
Yes.
In terms of, do you understand it? Have you measured it in the right way? And sort of post 2020, I think that was one of the outcomes in the publicly available report from FMA on NZX, where sort of understanding and measuring risk wasn't as effective as it needed to be at NZX. And sort of, I think if you look at DDoS as a specific example, the fact that it was rated as something that would be almost catastrophic in its effect on NZX, but absolutely remote in terms of its likelihood to occur, sort of what chief technology officer in their right mind is going to invest in money in a risk that's highly unlikely to occur. Now, that sort of basically illustrated perhaps a lack of understanding of the threat. So I think this is where organizations can certainly benefit from having somebody to advise them on how to measure risk appropriately in the cybersphere. So most organizations are well prepared to do it when it comes to finances, but cyber's slightly more sort of esoteric in nature, I guess you could say. So sort of it's good to have advice from someone who can advise you around sort of here is the level of threat that you're actually likely to meet in the real world.
And you very modestly, when we were preparing for this webinar, Lyall, you said everyone needs a Lyall. So what do you really mean by that? Is it that role you're talking about around risk identification? Is that the missing puzzle piece?
Yeah, I think, and risk measurement, right, in terms of getting the right size. So, sort of, obviously I talk a lot about DDoS, but that might not be the one thing that's really the biggest concern for your organization, right? It could be that you can afford to have your website down for 3 weeks and your business can keep running. But ransomware might be something different in terms of if your systems are unavailable, right? Then sort of you're out of business, and maybe you can't last a day, whereas you could last for 3 days with DDoS out. So I mean, the everyone needs a Lyall came from sort of the chief security officer of one of the world's biggest banks, who very kindly sort of gave time to mentor me, and he always made the point of, you're always going to hire me or someone like me. Now, I'm expensive, but if it's too late, then I'm really expensive.
Gets
So
harder,
better
more
you
expensive,
pay the
yep.
money up front than find out the hard way that you're going to have to spend a hell of a lot more money. So I mean,
So-
I think that's, you know, so you don't need a full-time me. You know, sort of for smaller entities, they can you know, find somebody to come in on a part-time basis, consultancy or whatever, to help build that picture of risk for your organization.
Yeah, look, Mike's asked a great question in the chat, which follows on from what you're saying there, Lyall. He's asked specifically whether it's something that CERT can help with when it comes to risk measurement. So, Jordan, you might be able to speak on that, or Rob. But I guess the point is well made, Lyall, that you know, you can't do this alone. you need to get the support. You need to get the expertise. So having the right questions being asked at a board level, management putting a focus on it is all good, but you need to get the expertise in to support you. So Jordan, on the point around risk measurement.
Yeah, so we wouldn't get involved with working out your risk measurement. That's something that has to be really done internally by someone who knows your systems. That said, once you've done that risk measurement, you'll have a better understanding of what controls need to be put in place to manage those risks. And we do provide advice around what we think are the most effective controls for New Zealand's ecosystem based on the reports that we've had over the last few years. And Jolene's actually a step ahead of both of us by posting the link to the critical controls there in the chat. That's got some guides on the controls and what they are, but it also goes on to some implementation guides as well for your more technical people.
Yeah, excellent. And I know from a supervision perspective, we make reference to those in terms of the types of controls we would be looking to see implemented and embedded in organisations that we supervise. And there's obviously global standards, the NCST cybersecurity framework is another example, which provides some good guidance. And that might be something else that Jolene could pop a link in the chat, because I'll probably get the URL wrong. So on that note, though, in terms of controls, Lyall, using NZX as an example, is there anything you can share in terms of specific changes that have been implemented in terms of border perimeter, or also in terms of preparedness and response if an incident occurs?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we've come a hell of a long way. I mean, I've been with NZX, I think 14, 15 months now. You know, so certainly incident response is one of those key elements in terms of any organisation I go into. You know, we you know, plan to fail because you know, sort of when you talk about controls, the money supply is never limitless. So, you know, there's always going to be a gap somewhere, and this is where the risk management element comes in terms of, you know, sort of if you can manage your risks well, you're going to deal with the most likely things that are likely to fail, or the things that will do the most damage to you. So that's a key element there. But you know, we work awfully hard on you know, sort of working our muscle memory around incident response at NZX. So we're doing you know, sort of senior leadership and technology response workshops quarterly. We've got one next week actually, which is you know, super fun. That's a hell of a lot of work to get that up and running. But we also do smaller ones, you know, with specific teams around what happens if you know, this particular business unit goes out of action for whatever reason, and we war game it with different scenarios. The fun element is, of course, when I'm speaking at something like this and the phone pings, because my team don't tell me when they're scheduling it, right? So I'm part of the sort of you know, ecosystem of planning on these things. With I shouldn't know when it's about to occur. So I was actually talking at a conference in front of about 300 people at one point earlier this year, and the phone rang and had to take it, and turned out it was an exercise. So I think, you know, sort of working on that and being prepared is you know, very much a key element. And I think, you know, the only major change that we've made is around assurance, is making sure we're doing the best possible job with the tools that we've got. So, you know, a simple example would be your antivirus. So, you know, we run the you know, sort of latest and greatest tool in that area. It does a heck of a lot more than antivirus. But when I got to NZX, we had it on 60% of our systems. So it's the 40% that don't have that tool installed that are going to blow us out of the water. So, we've gone to the point of making sure that we have 100% coverage on all of our sort of, protective and detective capabilities. And then we go through every month and check that they're doing what they should be doing. And all of that gets reported to the board because, post 2020, they're very interested in, sort of how cybersecurity is performing at NZX. Because I think, again, one of those key lessons was everybody was in the fire in 2020. So, from the board down, it wasn't just the technology team that were in the fire. The board had to front to the regulator. The executive had to front to the regulator. HR were trying to manage workloads for people in terms of sort of somebody who works 2 days a week and suddenly they need to come in for 7 days in a row. All those sort of little things that perhaps don't get thought about. Sort of frontline customer staff. We have a wealth fund that also manages KiwiSaver. So, again, the frontline staff there are on the phone to customers who can't get through to the website. So, sort of, it's not, in a sort of emergency situation, it's not just something that the technologists have to worry about. It's pretty much everybody in the organisation has some part to play in it. The CFO has to free up his wallet, sort of, and throw some cash a lot of the time. So, I think that's another one of those sort of, key elements. And really, apart from that, most of our changes have been soft rather than technology. We haven't bought new technology we didn't need to. We've improved our communications capability. So, managing messaging with externals, that be that your regulators or the media. So again, we've hired very experienced communications executive to help us manage messaging with our regulators and with the media.
Yeah, and I think that Optus example that Jordan raised earlier was an interesting case study. I'm not going to comment like you wouldn't, Jordan, on the specifics of the engagement with the media from senior management there, but certainly presented some challenges in terms of the way that an event like that is received by the general public when such a huge potential exposure in terms of just the volume and the private information that was made available via that event, and seems to have been somehow, has through some good luck, I think, has been managed as a in the short term. But I think the reputational damage is pretty hard to measure, and I don't think it's small. So let's get some final word from you, Rob, on this, and keen for extra questions to come into the chat to help us round out today. So, we've heard from Lyall around the NZX experience, and obviously cyber is at the front of mind for the board, senior management at all levels, as Lyall spoke about, and across the whole organisation. But what about those organisations that maybe haven't had that experience? They've been a little bit fortunate to date and haven't had an event. How, I think Cyber Week is a great example. So I'd love to hear about, the intent behind Cyber Week a little bit more. But how can we all of us play that role in ensuring that the right people are aware of cybersecurity and getting across the fact that it's not just a technology issue, as Lyall said. You're mute again, Rob. Oh, no. Double clicking it. There we go.
You got me?
Yep.
Right. I think Lyall's made some really, really good points, and yeah, we don't all have the luxury of large organisational systems and processes behind us, and I think it boils down to I think Lyall's made that point, and Jerry has too, that the understanding of the business is really important, and against your investment and your risk profile. And you don't need to be a large business to put good practices in place. I think there's one truism that whether you're a small business, a big business, you can no longer say you didn't know or you were told that everything was in place. It really is a collective responsibility these days, and Lyall's made, I think, quite a good point that at the end of the day, you need to understand what your risk profile is, and also understand about to what level you can invest, or what investment limits actually rest on where you're actually going to go. I think one thing that comes through quite strongly, I mean, I'm no techo, but it's easy to be mystified by technology and get befuddled by it. And I think the more we have conversations about the fact that technology is only an enabler, but at the end of the day, it's our practices, our approaches, and our understandings about cause and effect still come back to some pretty basic sort of principles. One thing that we've noted is that there quite often is a gap between decision makers and technical groups and businesses. So are they actually speaking the same language? Quite often you'll talk past each other and think you're actually talking about the same thing. So it's really important to get on that on the same page in terms of understanding what are the if you've been asked to do a particular technical investment, what does it mean? How does that benefit the business? How does it actually make us more robust or more resilient against some of these constantly changing, emerging technical cyber attacks? I think Jerry's made some good comment in terms of the types of conversations that should be occurring between boards, chief executives, and senior management. Do they really understand the business? Or are they taking a passive or a proactive understanding of what's actually going on? And do you have all the right systems and processes in place to give you assurance that things are going in the right direction? And that could be anything from employee training programs, simple things like floor walks. It's amazing what you can pick up wandering around the different levels and floors about what's happening or what's not happening, down to things like sticky notes on laptops that have actually got your password through to system or desktops that are left unlocked, etc. One area which I don't think has been touched on too much is around, we've spoken a lot about data breaches. What are the organisation views about data preservation? They've got legal responsibilities, we've got the oversight from the Privacy Commission, you've got a whole range of international protocols around transfer of information. So what are your data preservation processes? Do you understand what your retention and disposal requirements are, etc.? And then just touching a little bit, Jerry and Lyall have both spoken about incident response, and it's so, I think if anything, the overriding principle is be prepared and expect the unexpected. And I think that goes a long way to actually then informing how you're going to divvy up your investment into cyber, investment into technology, hardware. What are your practices? What are you going to invest in certain areas versus what's your risk? So it's fine to have an incident response plan, but are they actually joined up? Are they integrated? Are they being regularly practiced and adjusted? And do you know what your failover requirements, etc. are? And then the one thing that I think Lyall spoke on quite importantly is communication and reputation and understanding wider impacts. And we've seen a number of examples of organisations that are happy to manage stuff internally, but they haven't understood what in fact the impacts are around wider sort of stakeholders, shareholder cohorts, media, and also about internal communication into your board. Do you have ministers that are responsible for you? And also about your employees. Do they understand what's happening? Do they understand what their the expectations are on them, and also understanding what the assurance messages are. So consistency of messaging through communication across a very wide spectrum is absolutely critical. I don't mind talking a little bit about Optus, David, when you spoke about their media approach, which shifting from it's not actually our issue, we're the victim, as opposed to adopting a little bit more of a wider view about here is a huge group that is a custodian of millions of people's data, their information, and it wouldn't on the a fair suck of the sav litmus test, they fell short, and that just reflected to me that there wasn't a joined up understanding about how they're going to approach it, what their position would be, and providing those messages such as assurance. This is the problem. This is what we're going to do about it. We're going to fix it, and we're going to do it in this way. And it's very easy to shift the tide of public and stakeholder, shareholder opinion if you don't get that right. I'll stop there.
No, I agree. You said what I didn't feel like I should say, Rob. So
Well, perhaps I shouldn't have said that.
No. I think you're exactly right. And it's actually it's one of those moments that matter, I think, as an organization. As you said, you're a custodian of that information, and it's probably a missed opportunity, I think, for some real ownership and accountability to be taken there. So yeah, no, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that incident. So this is, I guess, your last chance now for those who are attending the webinar. If you do have any questions, now Jolene has probably cut off any questions in a really in a really good way with lots of awesome information in the chat channel. So I'd suggest that you grab those links. I also shared that the global US-based NIST cybersecurity framework, which I've used as a reference point, just for high-level frameworks. And so that's not a bad example of a starting point, I don't think, if you're in those early days, but getting that real tailored organization-specific risk identification, I think, would be my key takeaway today. If I'm going to go and do one thing, it would be encouraging organizations to get across their risk measurement. So that's my key takeaway. But I'll just open up now. Lyall, Jerry, Rob, and Jordan, is there anything else that you would specifically want to emphasize from the discussion today? Jerry, you first of all.
Yeah, I do have a few key recommendations from a supervisor's perspective. Among them being, David's mentioned earlier on about the FMA. FMA's recently issued paper on cybersecurity and operational systems resilience. They've also made key recommendations on a 2019 cyber resilience thematic review report. So I would suggest, for entities, management and board to have a read at those recommendations, and they are indeed very useful. Just from a supervisor's perspective, I would sort of sum up to three key recommendations that I guess I could provide, and that is ensure that cybersecurity forms part of your compliance assurance program, and it's reported to your relevant governance committees and board, and regularly monitored as well. And just to reiterate again, we want to encourage senior management and board members to understand the implications of a cybersecurity failure, particularly on the business and the key stakeholders, such as investors, for example. And the one thing that I missed out earlier on with respect to questions from supervisors is whether or not senior management and boards have actually considered how prepared the cyber resilience is for their critical outsource providers. In the case of fund managers or regulated fund managers, they're fund administrators and their custodians. Equally, if there is a failure on any one of those key providers, then the business and probably regulatory implications could be pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jerry. We're all part of that broader ecosystem. None of us are singular point. There can be a singular point of failure in that entire network or ecosystem of custodianship, as Rob used the term. So, Lyall, any final word from you? Any pearls? Final pearls?
Well, I think to build on what both Rob and Jerry have said there, which is, and Jolene's handily put in some of the FMA stuff there as well, right? Which is understand what your regulators' expectations are now, rather than finding out at the time that you know, they had a whole bunch of expectations that you didn't know about. So, you know, I think you know, sort of if you're a sort of a scalable organization that's, you know, sort of able to go and talk directly to the FMA, then that's fantastic, and you know, totally recommend that, and it's certainly something that we work very hard on. But you know, sort of getting an understanding of what the expectations are from the regulators, you know, can save you an awful lot of pain if and when the worst does actually occur to you.
Agreed. And I guess as your supervisor, for those of our clients who are on the call, we're happy to help you get your head around what the regulators' expectations are. That's, you know, fortunately part of the relationship that we as a supervisor can assist with that. So yeah, thank you, Lyall. Rob and Jordan, any final words from yourselves on Cyber Week? This is your special advertising last opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I'll let Jordan say his bit, but just want firstly thank you all very much for your interest in coming here, and I just want to thank David, Jolene, and Jerry for your interest in actually bringing this together. That's CERT's approach is to try and send messaging to as many people as possible, so that we can actually build understanding and resilience over time. And we're still on a journey. And so these sorts of fora are fantastic for understanding different viewpoints and just where we're actually heading to as a country. And I think that's great. That's and to have such quality speakers apart from myself, it's amazing. And we are continuing to build our service offerings to support groups such as these attendees. We're public servants and nowhere near as expensive as Lyall, but we try and do the same approach in terms of lifting resilience. But I'll let Jordan talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty. Thank you very much.
I won't talk too much more, Rob. Just wanted to take one minute really quickly to emphasise something that's already been said a couple of times around having an incident response plan. It is really important, and it will help you get through an incident in a much better state than if you didn't have a plan. And there's a few things you should make sure you build into the plan, mainly around coordination and communication. So some of those communication things that we talked about already, you know, internal, external stakeholders, and even media can all be built into your plan. And if you have this all ahead of time, that helps you be calm and handle the incident in a measured way, which is actually critically important when you're dealing with a highly stressful situation.
Yeah,
and yeah, just on the communication front, you can do some of the communication before incidents happen as well. One of my predecessors once said something along the lines of, if you're exchanging business cards during an incident, you're too late. So build your communication networks now before things happen.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Jordan. Ngā mihi and ka pai. Thanks to our panel, Rob, Jordan, Lyall, and Jerry. And special thanks from me to the team behind the scenes, especially Jolene and Lydia at Public Trust, and Felix as well. Thank you so much. So kia ora, ka kite. Thanks so much, and see you soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.